Thank you, Todd. Well, as Jan mentioned, I've all month long I've been talking about themes of death and resurrection. And starting next week, I'm going to be talking about Jesus and Jesus scholarship in 2012 and kind of where we are right now with all of that. And so today's kind of a transition day, and I'm going to be talking once again about resurrection and the resurrection story of Jesus, and actually beginning next month's theme today, talking about Jesus scholarship. Anthony LaDon is a young scholar who has a book out called Historical Jesus, What Can We Know and How Can We Know It? And in that book, he tells the story of being involved in the making of a documentary on exorcism. And he says, I was recently interviewed for a documentary on exorcism. Before they scheduled my interview, the filmmakers traveled to Africa, South America, and all over North America to film the rituals of exorcists. Before and after my interview, I got to do a bit of interviewing myself. And what I learned was that perceiving an exorcism is tricky. The modern mindset, where scientific reason is king, tends to see psychology, where other cultures see demons. And he talks about his experience interviewing the filmmakers. He interviewed them before they made the film and asked them what they thought about exorcism and what they expected to see. And then he interviewed them right after the filming was done, and they were back together again. And he says that after witnessing several of the rituals, these filmmakers were not so sure anymore about what they believed. The rituals they witnessed didn't fit nearly so neatly into their preconceived notion of sickness, informed by whatever science or pop psychology had been part of their upbringing. For a time, anyway. Because he says he goes back to interview them later, after some time had passed, and with some distance from the event, they were once again processing what they had experienced from a more modern perspective. They were probably, he says, more sensitive to different cultural understandings, but they were still living in their worldview and still thinking in their worldview. And so after a period of time, they had reintegrated what they had saw back into their own worldview. LaDon goes on to say, it is often the case that new perceptions conform to preconceived thought categories, and that thought categories remain in constant flux to accommodate new perceptions. Put more simply, you understand what you already understand. At the same time, understanding is possible only if previous held notions are flexible enough to add new information. If this sounds circular, it's because it is. And in fact, there's a name for it. It's called a hermeneutical circle. We all live within a circle of interpretation or understanding. We grow up from the time we are little and we learn a language. That very language shapes the way we think about everything we see and perceive. And then we also grow up in a culture. We grow up in a big culture. And if we grow up in America, we grow up in this kind of Western American culture. And then we grow up in smaller subcultures with our family. And if we happen, for instance, to go to a church community, we grow up within the culture of that community. And we learn a language there which shapes our perception. And then into that mix, you throw in your personality, your own individual personality and your personality type. And as we grow, we continually perceive and learn new things, but we interpret them within this kind of, as he describes it, this ever-moving circle of interpretation where we have new perceptions, we bring it back into our own mindset, what we've already learned, we think about it, we process it, and then we continue to move in this hermeneutical circle. And we live out our lives pretty much in this kind of circle. And this is opposed to the idea that we kind of are born with a blank slate. And we grow on this linear process where we are constantly taking in new information and changing our thinking. Instead, he says that we live out our lives in this circle of interpretation. We are always bringing to bear what we have already learned, all these preconceptions we have to everything that we think about. Which is his nice way of saying that we're all biased. Our understanding and our interpretation of every event that we experience is always biased by the hermeneutical circle that we grow up with. Our perceptions are never pure. They're never unfiltered. We see what we want to see, or what we have been brought up to see. He talks about a philosopher who's Martin Heidegger, who wrote about 50 years ago, who said that if we are unaware of this circle that we live in, then we live in a vicious circle. And we will never be able to really understand or appreciate anyone who grows up in another hermeneutical circle, who grows up in another culture and has a different language and a different way of perceiving reality. And we will tend to think that our way of thinking, because it's what we grew up with, must be the natural way, that everyone shares this way of thinking, that this is the true way. And we probably will also tend to think that our way is the superior way of thinking about things and understanding things. That's a vicious circle. We can, however, learn to appreciate our bias and to always be factoring that bias into our thinking about what we are seeing. We can realize that we are in this circle and that other people live in different circles, and that therefore we do not perceive reality, whatever is out there that's coming into our focus, in the same way. Ladon thinks that this is particularly important for biblical scholars to recognize their bias. Jesus scholars, he says, and I might add everyone who has an interest in Jesus, including those of us who go to church, we will always find the Jesus we are looking for. Now, this would be a good time to add another observation from Ladon, which is that the more significant a person is in history, the more differing interpretations there will be of that person. Think about that for a moment. The more significant a person is in history, the more differing their interpretations will be of that person. You might think it would be the other way around. That the more important a person is in history, the more they will be studied, the more facts will be uncovered about them, and the more knowledge we have about them, we ought to be able to agree on the significance of that person. But that's not the way it works. The more significant the person is in history, the more different interpretations there will be, because so many more people come at that person from within their circle of interpretation. And therefore, they will be talking about and studying and thinking and writing about that person from within their circle of interpretation. And so he says, whether you take Abraham Lincoln, or whether you take Paul, or whether you take Jesus, or whether you take Ronald Reagan, or Bill Clinton, it doesn't matter who it is, or any person from history you can think of, male or female, the more significant they are in history, the more different interpretations there will be about that person as time goes on. And the other thing he says that every new generation will have to do it all over again. They'll take what they have been given and what they have learned and rethink in light of their own time the significance of that person. Now, one of the interesting things he says about that in terms of Jesus is that this means that there is no true Jesus. And he says, there never was. Now he says that, of course, there was a man, Jesus. And he lived. He said certain things. He did certain things. He lived. He died. But from the moment he began to make an impact in his life, and then particularly from the moment he died, the significance of his life was up for debate. And what is remembered about him is what is debated about him. And what is not remembered is lost to history. The only history we have is what is remembered about Jesus. And from the moment there were people talking about Jesus, they were debating and arguing about the significance of Jesus. And this is particularly true for someone like Jesus because he never wrote anything down. He was an oral storyteller. And therefore, as he was going around and telling stories, he was telling the stories differently.